Hi all, welcome to the channel Sluggers Blue for your CAT VRC preparation. In today's session, we'll be taking up the fourth RC of the economics and management genre. And this RC was asked in the third slot of your CAT exam in the year 2020. And I've titled the RC as Following the Economic Crisis. Number of words, 498 with 5 questions, quite standard, pretty standard so far as CAT RC passages are concerned. So, all right, let's start. Now, for those of you who might be watching this session for the first time, know that the session is split into two parts. Part one, which is the passage explainer, where I take you through each and every paragraph of the passage and explain it in detail by the use of a schematic diagram. And part two is where I take you through the questions. The current video is part one. What you're watching right now is every session has two videos. This video is part one. And 40 such sessions make up a course that I've titled as an anthology of RCs for your reading comprehension preparation for the CAT. So, and those of you who have not watched the intro video and you are interested to know the details of the course, you can watch the intro video of this course by clicking on a cue card on the top right side of your screen. You should be able to see a letter I there, and if you click on that, it will show you the thumbnail of the intro video, which you can click and well, check out the details of the course. All right, so let's jump into the passage explainer now. Okay, so now guys, this is the passage explainer part of the video. Your passage explainer screen, your current screen is split into two parts. On the left side is where we'll have the passage, as you can see here, and on the right side is where we'll have the schematic diagrams. Now, the way we'll go about this is that I'll read and explain the passage paragraph by paragraph as the schematic diagram simultaneously appears on the right. Okay, post reading every paragraph, I'll explain the same in detail by the use of the schematic diagram that will have appeared by that time, and then move on to the next paragraph. All right, so let's start with the first paragraph. Okay, so let's start with the first paragraph, guys. It goes, I've been following the economic crisis for more than 2 years now. I began working on the subject as part of the background to a novel and soon realized that I had stumbled across the most interesting story I've ever found. While I was beginning to work on it, the British bank Northern Rock blew up, and it became clear as I wrote at the time that if our laws are not extended to control the new kinds of super powerful, super complex, and potentially super risky investment vehicles, they will one day cause a financial disaster of global systemic proportions. I was both right and too late because all the groundwork for the crisis had already been done. Though the sluggishness of the world's governments in not preparing for the great unraveling of autumn 2008 was then and still is stupefying. So that's the reading of the first paragraph. So guys, we can gather that in the first paragraph, the author has first of all he has used a narrative backdrop to talk about the idea that he wants to talk about, and where he starts with relating to us how long he has been following the crisis, how he stumbled onto the story, and then he starts the story, which is about the economic crisis that of 2008, and then briefly towards the end of the paragraph, he hints at what, according to him, was the cause or the factor behind the crisis, right? And then uh, it's covered by the code that he mentions, his own code, which he mentions here, that if our laws are not extended to control the new kinds of super powerful, super complex, and potentially super risky investment vehicles. Now, by the way, for those of you who do not know what an investment vehicle is, an investment vehicle is basically an expression that is used for any kind of investments that, well, financial institutions offer their clients for investment purposes. For example, it can be some tangible form of an investment like real estate, gold, etc., or it can be something like a bond or shares, and so on and so forth, right? So those are investment vehicles basically. Okay, so he basically makes the case that if the laws are not reformed to bring into control the new kinds of new types of super risky investment vehicles, then they will anyways end up creating a financial disaster, an economic disaster of global proportions. So he cites this as the cause, and then towards the end makes a slight comment on how the government was not very proactive, or did a disappointing job of getting ready for the economic crisis, right? And then he ends the paragraph. All right, so I hope that's clear. Let's move on to the next paragraph. Okay, guys, so let's start with the second paragraph. It says, But this is the first reason why I wrote this book, because what's happened is extraordinarily interesting. It is an absolutely amazing story full of human interest and drama, one whose byways of mathematics, economics, and psychology are both central to the story of the last decades and mysteriously unknown to the general public. We have heard a lot about the two cultures of science and the arts. We heard a particularly large amount about it in 2009 because it was the 50th anniversary of the speech during which CP Snow first used the phrase. But I'm not sure the idea of a huge gap between the science and the arts is as true as it was half a century ago. It's certainly true, for instance, that a general reader who wants to pick up an education in the fundamentals of science will find it easier than ever before. It seems to me that there's a much bigger gap between the world of finance and that of the general public, and that there is a need to narrow that gap. If the financial industry is not to be a kind of priesthood administering to its own mysteries and feared and resented by the rest of us. Many bright and literate people have no idea about all sorts of economic basics of a type that financial insiders take as elementary facts of how the world works. I'm an outsider to finance and economics, and my hope is that I can talk across that gulf. So, yeah, that was the reading for the second paragraph. Now, guys, see, it seems like the author has talked about a lot in this paragraph, but if you really look at it, he's basically just talked about just two ideas. The first idea is that well, he the reason one of the reasons that he has written the book is because he figures that the economic crisis by itself is like it's quite interesting. Found it quite interesting. Like it is full of. He says that it is an absolutely amazing story full of human interest and drama and so on and so forth. And then the second reason he and the second point that he has mentioned in the paragraph overall is the gap between the general public and the world of finance and economics, right? And he basically wishes he basically talks about his endeavor to narrow that gap, to make the otherwise generally literate public more acquainted or better acquainted with at least the basics of finance. And then he talks about this gap in the backdrop of the gap of arts and science, right? This is basically just an idea that he has used as a backdrop. He basically says that 50 years ago, maybe there was too much of a gap between science and art, the two cultures, right? As he cites CP Snow, and he says that 50 years ago, maybe there was too much of a gap between these two cultures, but now there is not much. On the other hand, so he has used this as a backdrop, and he says, on the other hand, the gap between the world of finance and the general public is quite a bit and needs to be addressed. So that's essentially what the second paragraph has just been about two ideas. That's it. Okay. And I'm saying this to help you understand that RCs usually guys are they might often to some learners seem a little complicated because it seems like there's too much going on. But frankly speaking, it's just about an RC is nothing but just a collection of 4 to 5 ideas which have been structured together to make a proposition or an argument by the author. Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph now. Coming to the last paragraph, my need to understand is the same as yours, whoever you are. That's one of the strangest ironies of this story. After decades in which the ideology of the Western world was personally and economically individualistic, we have suddenly been hit by a crisis which shows in the starkest terms that whether we like it or not, and there are large parts of it that you would have to be crazy to like, we are all in this together. The aftermath of this crisis is going to dominate the economics and politics of our societies for at least a decade to come, and perhaps longer. That, guys, was the reading of the last paragraph. Okay, now see, the author has basically, there are two parts to it. Okay, if you see from an overview perspective, the paragraph just has two parts. In the first part, he basically just says that, well, the authors need to understand the finance and the economics industry is the same as our need to understand. Like we both need to, right? And with that, he also points out the irony of the situation, where he says that, well, that the ideology of the Western world, for the most part in the last few decades, has been individualistic, right? But the crisis has shown us that we are actually in this together. That means now it is not so individualistic after all. So that's the irony he points out here. So that's the first idea that he presents in the paragraph. Second idea is he basically says that second idea is also about, it also justifies why the author as well as all of us need to understand the financial and the economic world. Okay, how the world works in so far as the financial and the economic domains are concerned. So this is the substantiation of the need for us to understand. Why do we need to understand it? Why? Because the aftermath of the economic crisis is going to dominate the economics and the politics of our society for at least a decade and probably longer. And that's the reason why he believes that there is a need for us to understand. Okay, so that's understand the world of economics and finance. So that's your third paragraph. Oh, sorry, not third, second paragraph, last paragraph. Okay, guys. So let's now before we move on to the central idea part section of the video, there's something that I want to talk about. I want to address a kind of query or maybe a set of series of queries that I usually get from learners, and which goes something like that when they are reading the first, when they start reading the second paragraph, they forget what the author had said in the first paragraph, or basically they are not able to keep track of the ideas or the notions or the topic that the author has talked about as they go on reading the whole passage, right? They forget what they read just a few a minute earlier in the earlier part of the passage as you couldn't go on to the next part of the passage. And the reason why this happens with many learners that is that they are not grouping the ideas properly. Okay. See, what do I mean by grouping the ideas? So as you can see here on your screen, what we've done here is I'm not just, I've talked about the ideas in detail. Like almost each of these graphics take care of the sentences and the expressions that the author has talked about here. But at the same time, I also grouped them separately, right? So for example, on this side, you just have a narrative backdrop that the author has provided to discuss all of his core ideas, right? What is the narrative backdrop? Narrative backdrop is basically when he talks about things which are not directly essential to the core argument, but they just provide an essential, not unnecessary, but yes, but not core either, just an essential backdrop to the whole discussion. Okay, where he talks about how long he has been working on the following the economic crisis. How did he stumble onto that, and then he also talks about how the reason why he's writing a book. The reason is mentioned here, and the fact that he's writing a book on it is mentioned here, right? So this is now these elements are not core to it. These are just essential. They just serve as an essential backdrop. So that can be a useful way of grouping this. On the other hand, on this side, as you see, the core argument of the author is covered by these four ideas. If you see, right here, this is where he mentions why knowing about the economic crisis is useful, because it's a very interesting story. It involves byways of mathematics, economics, and psychology, etc. And then he talks about how, and then this is the second idea where he talks about how the gap between the general populace and the world of finance is quite wide, and even wider than the gap that used to be between the sciences and the arts, right? And hence this gap needs to be this. He says that he will endeavor to talk across this gulf. And then in the last paragraph, he talks about two ideas. He mentions the irony of individualism and the current situation that we're facing right now. And finally, why is it important for all of us to understand the financial and the economic world, right? Because, well, the aftermath of the financial crisis is going to have repercussions on the economic and political aspects of the society for the decades to come. So if we look at whether you'll be able to recall how much you'll be able to recall the content of the passage is dependent on what level are you viewing these ideas. Okay, so for example, if I get rid of all of these categorizations, now if you look at this whole schematic, it seems quite chaotic, right? Because there seems to be so many ideas here. Maybe something about laws should be extended to these new investment vehicles, government being very sluggish, interesting economic crisis background, and the common need to understand the financial market. There's no proper classification here, and that's the reason why it becomes. So if you go on to differentiate it to the highest level possible, it doesn't make sense. You won't be able to recall the ideas very easily. And on the other hand, if you don't differentiate it at all, if you integrate the whole thing in just one big lump, you again get the same result, right? If you think of it as just one idea, again, because this is too low resolution and the one before this was too high resolution. So you need to find the right balance between these, which is nothing but, well, what we did here. We went to the right level of differentiation. So now we just have a set of 5 to 6 ideas, which encapsulates whatever the author has been trying to say here. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about, and this is what you would want to practice. Okay, when I say practice, obviously you don't have to draw all these diagrams. That's very obvious. I hope you guys understand, are matured enough to understand that this is just for your understanding that I draw these diagrams to bring more clarity to the passage. You're just supposed to know that, like as you read the passage, you're just supposed to note the major ideas, okay, that the author is talking about, or the major notions that he's talking about. All right, so yeah, that's about the passage explainer. Let's go to the central idea. Okay, guys, so the central idea of the passage is essentially this, that given the compelling story behind the economic crisis and the economic and political repercussions that it might have on society in the times to come, it is important for the general public to get better acquainted with the fields of finance and economics, right? So it covers all the major ideas that we've noted in the schematic here. Okay, all right, so let's, with that we end the session. That is the central idea. And now, those of you who have not attempted the questions, you can do so by clicking on the link which is available in the description of the video. And I'll see you there in the second part of the session where we discuss the questions. Okay. And yeah, so see you in the next part.